it's an appropriate time to turn it over to you to start the meeting.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. We're glad you're here. We're going to discuss a pretty important subject that I think we will all be affected with. And I think we've also seen it over many years. And I think it's appropriate that we be called to this activity. And so let's pray for some guidance in doing it. Gracious God, as we gather together to discuss the problems that we ascertain in our areas, let us do it with you in mind, with your guidance, with your participation, and with your ability to teach us and have us discern what your will may be. Be with us now as we discuss racism as it affects the people in our Presbytery, making sure that we understand the breadth and the width of all that is about us. And let us do it in a manner in which we seek understanding. Let us do it in a manner that we seek an ability to dismantle the things that are causing us problems between each other, recognizing that you created us all equal, you created us with unique characteristics and capabilities, and we all should all benefit from them. And we pray these things in the name of your Son, our Lord, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Bob?
Thank you, Charlie. I just want to take a minute here to do a little technical introduction to the afternoon. First of all, to say welcome everyone. And if you haven't seen a docket for today's meeting, there is one posted on the Presbytery website on the Presbytery meeting page. You're welcome to go to that and check it out. I can also post it here, but we'll be using the screensaver function quite a bit today, posting a lot of things, so I don't want to take up too much space with that. We are using the Zoom webinar format that we've used before. Ministers, elders, and guests will only be able to see and hear the panelists, those of us who are sort of signed up to talk in this meeting. One of these days we'll be brave enough to do the regular Zoom format and let everybody talk, but for right now we're still going to try limiting it a little bit. If you have a question for any of the speakers at any time during this session, feel free to enter it into the chat function of the webinar. There's a chat button down at the bottom of the screen. If you press that, little chat box will pop up, and Donna Scully and Sarah Holben are both monitoring that. They'll monitor it for substance of questions and for technical issues. So anything you need to know or need help with, put it in there, and we'll get it to the right person. Due to time limitations, I won't promise we'll address all the questions. There are probably a few more questions about racism than we're able to get to today, but we do want to know what you're thinking, so feel free to use the chat box liberally. It'll help us discern what our future steps are along this path to dismantling racism. The last piece I'd like to say is for the panelists, those of you who are going to be speaking today, when you're not speaking, please mute yourself. I'm going to mute myself in a minute so that those comments I make to Sarah, who's sitting behind me, and other comments that I might make during this meeting won't be heard by everyone. It'll help make our speakers be heard that much more clearly. So with those technical bits of advice, I'll turn it back over to Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to be using this Zoom format, and we've got guests, we've got some elders present. We'll be able to see all that's going on. And we're going to be talking about the fact that it's due time that we limit the racism that is causing so much problems in our society. We are some number of years started discussing the matter, it got waylaid by a number of activities that seem to take precedence, but they don't take precedence, and we need to get back to it, and we need to get back in a big way and soon. And so we wanted to get up to date on where we stand with this panelist type of activity and presentations so that people can reorient their minds to where we were and where we need to go. And we'll be plotting where we need to go by way of the discussion as it proceeds today. So instead of talking about it, let's get into it. And our first presentation will be by Tracy Keenan. Tracy?
Thank you, Charlie. And I will be brief. I want to thank you for being here, Newcastle Presbytery. You know, it's a tumultuous time in our world, and you know that church needs to be not only our comfort and our refuge, but also our inspiration and our catalyst for being a force for goodness and righteousness. You know, think about it. Our Bible contains Psalms and the prophets. Jesus himself had words of love and acceptance, and also words of challenge. And as a Matthew 25 presbytery, we are committed to dismantling racism as well as to eliminating systemic poverty and to revitalizing our churches. And all three of those things are connected. When church is known to be people who care about the wider world in which we live, then others can see that this Jesus we follow loves them too. And racism is a difficult topic for many of our churches. I know this, we all know this. In our churches, we have angry people, we have annoyed people, we have fearful people. When we want the church to be our mighty fortress, you know, our safe haven from the uproar of the world, we may be reluctant to talk about race. And we have people who are perplexed by the fury. They say things like, well, the equal rights are already in our law books, so the problem must lie elsewhere. They say that they're not racist, that they've not been acting in any ways that perpetuate the problem. They might even say that they're really tired of hearing about this. If that is you, I really want to thank you for being here. And I'm hoping that you will give this time together a chance to help us understand things that we may not have understood before. And that I know we have people here who are passionately anti-racist, and many of you will feel like the choir to whom messages are preached today. And it may feel kind of easy to say amen and to hope that others are hearing what you think they need to hear. But I hope you too will learn things today, that all of us will hear things that we had not considered before, that our hearts will be moved, that our perspectives will be deepened and widened to see the bigger picture of where and how change can come. We're not here to shame anyone. We are here to listen and to learn and to share the things that weigh on our hearts. So let it be a safe place for truth, and let the power of the Holy Spirit guide us. We begin with General Assembly Commissioners Rourke Moore and Emma Horn, who represented us at the 224th General Assembly a couple of weeks ago. And one of the primary actions of that assembly of our denomination was to create and improve a call to the churches to address the sin of racism. So they are going to share that process. They're going to share the debate, their experiences, and the finished product. So I turn it over to Emma and Rourke.
Good afternoon. Thank you for everyone who's participating, and I want to thank the panelists that I have the auspicious pleasure of serving with this afternoon. I'm going to, I guess, provide a little context. I think that's my charge this afternoon. A little context around, one is maybe how we got involved, and then how that involvement impacted at least my impression of the 224th General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church USA. A number of us, the Senate of the Mid-Atlantic sponsored a trip to Montgomery, Alabama in February, I believe. And if you are familiar with the civil rights movement at all, you know that Montgomery was the hub of the civil rights movement. And if you have been keeping pace with current cinema and literature, you might know that Brian Stevenson is the author of a book called Just Mercy and a movie after the name of the book. And Brian is from Delaware, a Harvard-trained attorney, and has been dedicating his life work to promoting justice, particularly for those people who are generally underrepresented or not represented, particularly in capital cases. So when we went to Montgomery, we had an opportunity to tour the Equal Justice Initiative. And I'm not sure you can see, but I have on an Equal Justice Initiative shirt that I got when I was in Montgomery. And I'm going to maybe a little bit later explain to you some of my personal background. But I'm a baby boomer and was impacted by the civil rights movement and the work of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And so it was great for me to go to Montgomery and to see the work that's still being done and how Brian is working to represent people who are adversely impacted by our criminal justice system, and more often than not, people of color and or poor. And so when I got to the General Assembly and saw that they had at least the candidates for co-moderator, at least two of them were of people of color. One was a woman who originates her family heritage from Delaware. She's of Nanticoke heritage and from Delaware. And another gentleman from Alabama, a gentleman from Alabama, I should say, whose name is Gregory Bentley. And they were candidates for co-moderators. I was ecstatic and overjoyed that the 224th General Assembly chose to elect those two individuals as co-moderators of the Presbyterian Church USA. And I'm not sure that we always recognized when history is being made, but a predominantly white denomination as the Presbyterian Church USA is now being led by people of color. Our stated clerk is an African-American male, and the co-moderators are of indigenous heritage and African-American heritage. And so for me, that's a very significant thing and sort of set the tone for how the General Assembly moved through its work. And we in the General Assembly were impacted by COVID-19 just as we are in the Presbytery. So the General Assembly set a history in a couple of different ways. One is that we met via Zoom over 4 days. And so a lot of the work that would have been done in a General Assembly heretofore was deferred. Some of it was deferred until the next General Assembly. But I was impressed that the people who were gathered via Zoom were inspired by current events, particularly the current fight for social economic justice in this country, and continue to advocate for such during the General Assembly. Now, Emma and I will talk a little bit more about that later, but some of the feedback from some people who were participants of the General Assembly was that they felt like there was a lot of hostility, and some people referred to it as microaggression. I can't say that that was my feeling. Maybe it was because it was my first General Assembly, and equally important, that I knew that history was being made, and things like that do not come easily without a fight. And so in that respect, I was pleased that some of the things that did not get addressed fully at least got voice and recognition. And I was, again, overjoyed that we were able to elect the co-moderators that we elected. And so the outgoing moderators, one was of Hispanic descent and the other white female. So I was just ecstatic that we were able to move the ball a little more closer to the goal line. And I'll turn it over to Emma at this point.
So friends, I know that if you are in this meeting, you are challenged by or interested in this work. Before we dig into the actual work that the General Assembly did and challenged all of us to do, I want to think about some words that you may have heard in church or said in your own churches. Words from the Confession of 1967, the Confession of Belhar, and Matthew 25. In C67, we hear, in Jesus Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself. Jesus Christ is God with man. And it continues, therefore the church calls men to be reconciled to God and to one another. And later in that same confession, it speaks to the call to reconciliation in society, saying, in each time and place, there are particular problems and crises through which God calls the church to act. The church, guided by the Spirit, humbled by its own complicity, and instructed by all attainable knowledge, seeks to discern the will of God and to learn how to obey in these concrete situations. And it continues speaking about how we are called out to speak out against discrimination and racism. Friends, this is a confession that is already in our book of confessions that we are already using in many of our churches. In the Confession of Belhar that just came into wider acceptance not too long ago, we say that we believe that Christ's work of reconciliation is made manifest in the church as a community of believers who have been reconciled with God and with one another. We say that we believe that the church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And finally, in the Matthew 25 imperative that we have adopted as a Presbyterian that many of your churches may have bought into, we hear those words of Matthew 25 and we dive deep and are challenged to live into the ideas of eradicating systemic poverty, dismantling structural racism, and building congregational vitality. These are words that we are already using in our churches and ideals and ideas that we are striving for. And it's from these words that used as a springboard to the work of the General Assembly. So our work of the General Assembly and our work as a presbytery even now is to think about how those words are lived out in real and in challenging ways. Rourke, would you share a little bit more about your experience and how these words speak to the intersection of who you are and how you move about this world?
Thank you, Emma, and everyone else. Again, thank you for participating. in this. And let me first give this disclaimer as I share a little bit of my story. The African American story is not a monolithic story. Okay. So I want to put that at there first, is that my story, I may, parts of it may intersect with other African Americans and be similar, but we are not a monolith. And so we, like anyone else, interpret the world sometimes differently. Okay, so let me begin with my story. And I shared with you earlier that we went to Montgomery and toured the Legacy Museum and what is referred to as the Lynching Museum. One of the things they have done at the Lynching Museum is they have gathered soil in jars from places where people, African Americans, were lynched. And the names are on the jars from the individuals that were lynched. One of the names that was on the jars, one of the jars, was the surname Singleton. The person's surname was Singleton. That impacted me because my mother's maiden name, my grandfather, was Hosea Singleton from Parksdale, Arkansas. Now, the way the story goes is my parents, like a lot of African Americans, were of the Great Migration. And so if you want a good book, it's on the reference list that you'll get an opportunity to review later. The author's name is Isabella Wilkerson. The name of the book is The Warmth of Other Suns, and she traces some people through the Great Migration. Well, my grandfather, Hosea Singleton, and his wife, Mary Singleton, were tenant farmers. And if you're familiar with tenant farmers farming, that's one step out of slavery. So people rented land from the landowner, farmed the land, and rarely if broke a profit, broke even, because they got charged for everything. And so for all intent and purposes, it was slavery by another name. My grandmother was, and everybody, you know, in the family picked cotton. They sent children out in the cotton field early. And so early on, my parents, my grandparents and their children, my aunt, my mother and her sister were picking cotton. And the overseer went to my grandmother and told her she wasn't working fast enough and that she needed to work faster. Well, my grandmother, being a spirited woman, suggested to the overseer that the only person that told her what to do was her husband. So the overseer went to see my grandfather. Shortly thereafter, my grandparents relocated to Wilmington, Delaware, because my grandfather knew, as I understand it, that he was more than likely going to be lynched because of that particular altercation. And so when I saw the name Singleton on the jar, it struck a response chord for me. And so my parents moved to Wilmington, Delaware. Different. My father was from North Carolina, and their families moved to Delaware. They were educated at Howard High School. And if you're familiar with Wilmington and Delaware at all, you know that Howard High School was the only high school in the state that provided an education for African American students. So students came from Milford, boarded with families to go to Howard High School. So the first house that I can remember that my family lived in was in public housing, which is now known as South Bridge. Then we moved from South Bridge to Dunleith Estates. Now, Dunleith is a community just south of the city of Wilmington, in between the city of Wilmington and Old Newcastle and in Newcastle County. Dunleith Estates was the first community, particularly in Delaware and maybe the country, suburban community, to be built specifically for African Americans. Leon Weiner, who was a housing developer, understood that white GIs were able to buy housing because of the GI Bill. African American vets were locked out of the housing market, and so Leon built a housing specifically for African Americans. That's where I grew up. The community had its own school system. We were educated from grades 1 through 9. It was a perfect blend of Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And by that, I mean Booker T. was suggested that African Americans ought to be educated in the trade, and Du Bois felt that African Americans needed to educate the talented 10th so that they could set the example for the community. So Dunleith Community School was a wedding of those two. I generally did not have contact with white people until I went into a retail situation. Okay, so both of my grandparents lived in the city of Wilmington, and one lived on the east side. My father's parents lived on the east side. My mother's parents started out on the east side and then moved to the west side of Wilmington. My only contact with white folks was through a retail transaction. And then in the 9th grade, I explained to you that my school only went to the 9th grade. We had to go to what was Delaware High School, which was an integrated high school. And I think at the point that I went, it may have been in its third or fourth class of integration. And that's when I discovered my otherness. I can remember having a class or school friend. We were very, very close. He was my best friend. One of my best friends. And it was what I'm going to relate to is an incident that has stayed with me forever. He was my best friend. When we were in school, we always palled around together. We went in class together, best friend. Well, one Saturday, I'm in downtown Wilmington, walking along Market Street, and I encounter him. And I am so happy to see my friend. We're in school together, and I see my friend. And I spoke to him with all this enthusiasm. And he was with 3 of his white friends. And I spoke with him with all this enthusiasm and warmth that I could muster up. And he didn't speak. And then that's when I really became aware of the other, okay? That I was of the other. Now I'm going to fast forward a bit. I went to Delaware State, got involved in the student activity in the civil rights movement. And on one occasion, we protested with women who were receiving what was then called welfare assistance. And we were protesting the state to increase their allotment. And I walked into the state house with all the other protesters, and there were state police all around the Capitol Rotunda. If you've ever been in Lake Hall, you know, it's like a rotunda, and the steps from the second floor and the big banister and the steps trail down. Well, they were all lined on the top, on the second floor, and they all had their badges covered with black tape so that you could not identify them. Well, I finished school. In between finishing school, I went in the Air Force. And as I was sharing with Emma yesterday, when I went in the Air Force, I got stationed in Arizona. Was the first time two things ever happened to me. Was the first time I was ever really exposed to the Indian population, American Indian or indigenous people population. When I went to Phoenix, I was stationed at a base. I was there for more than a week before I ever ran into another black person. Okay? And for me, that was really strange. Well, I got out of the Air Force, had a lot of different experiences. One of those experiences when I got out of the Air Force is I was elected to the state house. So the House of Representatives for the state of Delaware, from representing the part of the city. When I got sworn in, I used Hosea Singleton's Bible, my grandfather's Bible, who was a sharecropper. And when I got sworn in, we took a picture in the Capitol Rotunda. And as I was standing there on the steps of the rotunda, I realized that I had gone 180. The last time I could remember being in that building was protesting for women, and the state troopers had their badges covered. And here I was now taking a picture with the people who I was being sworn in with at the same place where I had entered before, with police who were, for me, a very frightening thing. Using my grandfather's Bible. Now, I said to me, the police were a frightening thing. And I'm going to end with this, because this may be an experience that many African Americans have, regardless of where they come from. One day last week, I'm riding down, I live right off of Market Street. I get in the car, I drive down Market Street. It's like 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm 70 years old, a law-abiding citizen. This police car comes up behind me with his lights flashing. I grabbed the steering wheel, holding on for dear life, knowing that I had not done anything wrong. Nonetheless, scared to death. I have had that same experience whatever season of my life I was in. When I was in the legislature, if a cop rode behind me, I had vanity tags. I mean, saying that I was a state legislator. I get scared to death. The first time that I got stopped by a police officer, well, I say one of the times I got stopped, it was for a simple traffic violation. The officer approached the car with a shotgun drawn on me. Another time I was around 18, 19 years old. I'm walking through Wilmington. I see a police car. They're parked. There's a couple officers standing outside the car. I'm walking past them. They asked me to come to them. I said, okay. They asked me, had I seen anybody run? I said, run by him. I said, no. So they asked me where was I going. I told them where I was going. They said, would you mind getting in the car? I said, no, you know, I can't say yes. So I get in the car. They take me to Market Street in front of what was then the Grand Theater. And they asked me if I would step out the car. I said, okay. I stepped out the car. The woman said, no, I told you he was 6 feet tall. Thank you.
We are so thankful to Rourke for sharing his experiences, because we know the work of General Assembly and the work of all of this gives us space to hear stories that are not our experiences and are not our stories. And in the work of General Assembly, we tried to hear many of those stories as much as we could. Now, I know we have many stories that we want to hear in this space that we have together today. So I want to just briefly walk us through some of the work of the General Assembly, the work that we decided to do and decided to challenge the presbyteries to do as well. On the events page somewhere on the website, you will find a document called "On the Church in This Moment in History, Responding to the Sin of Racism and a Call to Action," approved as amended by the General Assembly. And I invite you to take time, not right the second though, to read that document and to digest it deeply and to be challenged by it. I want to pick up just a few of the points that we were challenged by in this document. We were challenged to pay attention to how the great ends of the church intersect in the roles in which we have found ourselves as a white-dominated church, and the ways in which our church has lived into systemic racism and not named it. We are challenged to listen to the voices of those that are involved in the work of justice in the Poor People's Campaign and across the world, and in Freedom Rising, the initiative. During the assembly too, we had the powerful experience of holding those 8 minutes and 46 seconds for George Floyd. And friends, if you have held that silence, you know just how long it is. Imagine a Zoom meeting with 760 something people in it in complete silence and recognizing that loss. We were challenged too to think about how the work that we do as a presbytery, the work that we're doing right now, is important, and how we need to continue to have those conversations. And friends, as we are doing today, we know that this work does not wait for the next General Assembly. There are things that we can learn about and dig into now. When you pull up that document, you will find some other documents linked to, which I know us Presbyterians, we love all sorts of documentation. But if you read those documents, you will hear the voices and perspectives of people that are not brought forward very often. And we have the chance to do that work as a presbytery, to sit in the uncomfortable and to think about what we need to do to live into hearing the voices of Black women and girls, to work into thinking about those resolutions and those decisions, and that knowledge that there are some places where there is a lack of installed pastoral leadership and people of color congregations in the PCUSA, a document that was put together by the Racial Equity Advocacy Committee. These are not stories of other people in other places, but stories that we need to hear and digest and wrestle with as our own presbytery. And we think about how we are challenged to have these conversations, to speak truth and power and challenge, even as it makes us uncomfortable and we want to turn away from it. The the General Assembly was also excited that the stated clerk was willing to put his name on the letter that was written by the Poor People's Campaign. And if you get a moment to research that, you will see that there is powerful language in it. Finally, the work of the General Assembly on this particular call to action called us to reflect on a poem, to let it move us and work in us and make us uncomfortable. So friends, as we prepare to continue this conversation, I invite you to do a couple of things. Add them to your to-do list because I know those are probably already a mile long. First, look for this document. Read it, digest it, see what you think and what you feel. Read the documents it recommends. Be uncomfortable in it. Be challenged by it. And think about the ways in which we can continue to wrestle with this as a presbytery, not just in big events like this, but in our individual churches, our sessions, our Bible studies, our conversations. So friends, as we tie up this piece about the work of the General Assembly, I want to read the poem that was at the end of this document. Friends, hear these words. A knee on a neck, laying bare for all to see, the evil of callous, soulless, entitled power, choking the life from God's beloved just because. We know we must change. Will we, church? We have written many true, significant, sometimes even sincere words. We have confessed Bellhauer, C67, Barman. Enough words? Never enough witness. We know we must change. Will we, church? Kairos. Amen.
Thank you, Emma and Rourke. Next up, we have Sue Linderman, who is an elder at Westminster Church in Wilmington. She was one of the founders of Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group a couple of years ago. And she has put together a class called Racism in America, Exploring Our History. And she was talking about the kinds of things that we did not learn about in history class when we were growing up. She's teaching it not only at Westminster, but at Willow Valley Retirement Community, Quest for Learning series in Lancaster, PA. And she's not able to do, obviously, the whole thing, but she's giving us a slice that's tailor-made for us for this event. So Sue, we turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. It's good to be here. Yeah, this is about a 3-hour class that I'll try to do in, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes, something like that. Bob, I think you're going to show the charts. Is that right? Is there like a slideshow version view? Oh well.
I'll keep
We'll
trying
go
to get back to it.
I think if you click on slideshow and then go start from the beginning, it'll fill out the screen. There's slideshow at the top.
You've gone to.
That's all right. I can adapt. Thank you. Excellent. This picture is Point Comfort, Virginia. This was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine section when they did the 1619 project earlier this year. And that is the place in America where the first ship with Africans came ashore in 1619. Okay, next slide. The purpose of this class, the whole class, is to develop a better knowledge and understanding of our country's racial history. Because once we know it, it changes how we view the present and our place in it. Our history is a legacy of racial inequality that was grounded in the enslavement of millions of Black people and then followed by decades of terrorism and racial subordination through public policy and cultural attitudes. My own personal experience, I loved history, I majored in political science. My American history class went through the Civil War with a little bit of Reconstruction in those dang carpetbaggers. And then it kind of picked up again with World War II. And what I've learned as a result of doing research that was triggered by the murder, the deaths of so many unarmed Black men 2, 3, and 4 years ago, is that history that took place in between the end of the Civil War and World War II, and even to the present, is hugely important in understanding who we are as a country and what our beliefs are. Next. So here are all the topics that get covered, and I will touch on them, but only briefly. The beginning of slavery, the economic imperative that it brought to the colonies and to the early United States, Civil War, Reconstruction, Black codes and Jim Crow laws, terrorism, the Great Migration, which Rourke referenced, the FHA and housing segregation, which is huge in terms of its impact, school desegregation, the civil rights movement, war on drugs, mass incarceration, voter suppression, and the criminal justice system. And finally, the question, where do we go from here? All of these stages of our history have led us to where we are now. Next. So slavery began in 1619 in Jamestown, Virginia, with the arrival of that ship. And over that period of time until 1750, slavery was legalized in many of the colonies and the states. But because the North was less agricultural than the South, those northern states began abolishing slavery between 1774 and 1804. So slavery was gone as a legal condition by the early 1800s in the North. The US Constitution is an interesting document. One of the things that you may know that it references that slaves are counted as 3/5 of a person. So from the beginning, a Black person was less than a white person in the eyes of the United States government. Interestingly, Native Americans counted as nothing. In fact, the Declaration of Independence refers to Native Americans as, quote, merciless Indian savages. So that's our Declaration of Independence. The Constitution allowed for abolishing the importing of slaves, but only after 20 years had elapsed. So at the elapsing of that 20-year time period, the US outlawed the importing of slaves, but more slaves were needed than ever before. And that marked the beginning of the domestic slave trade, where the country needed a self-producing labor force. So almost 1.5 million slaves were sold at auction, families split up, destroyed, and males forced bred to create yet more slaves to work on the plantations or wherever. Next. I'm sorry, Bob, next. I'm sorry, go back. I didn't see it. Sorry. Thank you. So originally, tobacco was the crop of choice, but tobacco's tough on the land, and that actually led to all the westward expansion that happened in the United States, and the South moved to cotton. Cotton was a tough product to turn into fiber because pulling all those little parts out of the bolls of cotton was very time consuming. And so there was a limit to the amount of cotton that could be processed until Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1793, and suddenly the demand for cotton exploded. So by the mid-1800s, cotton was America's leading export. In the midst of all of this going on, one of the most significant Supreme Court cases took place. And you'll notice through our history that the Supreme Court plays a pivotal role in the history of slavery and inequitable treatment of people. The Dred Scott case affirmed that Blacks, slave or free, could never become citizens, and they had no federal rights whatsoever. It's widely considered to be the worst decision ever rendered by the Supreme Court. And given some of the ones that we've had lately, that's saying something. In any case, Chief Justice Taney wrote in the majority decision, in the opinion of the court, the legislation and histories of the times and the language used in the Declaration of Independence show that neither the class of persons who had been imported as slaves nor their descendants, whether they had become free or not, were then acknowledged as a part of the people, nor intended to be included in the general words used in that memorable instrument. They had, for more than a century before, been regarded as beings of an inferior order and altogether unfit to associate with the white race, either in social or political relations, and so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, and that the Negro might justly and lawfully be reduced to slavery for his benefit. So by 1860, the United States had nearly 4 million slaves, more than half of them living in the South, where they made up a third of the population, and 80% of the total United States GDP was tied to cotton, which led, of course, to the Civil War. Lincoln was one of 4 candidates running for president. He was elected. Within 3 months, the southern states began seceding. 13 states ultimately seceded, and there is a myth that the war wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. It's interesting if that is something that somebody believes. I commend you to read the Articles of Secession from the 13 states that make it pretty clear what their purpose was. And in fact, in something called the Cornerstone Speech on March 21st of 1861, Alexander Stephens, who was the Vice President of the Confederacy, said, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition." And so less than a month later, the Civil War began. In 1863, we know the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, and it freed 4 million slaves in the 10 southern states that were still in rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation only referred to those 10 states. When the slaves were freed, it deprived the Confederacy of most of its labor force. And ultimately in 1865, the Civil War ended with 620,000 dead, 1.5 million casualties, and 179,000 African Americans had fought in the Union Army. 40,000 were killed. So it had huge impact. And that's what most of us learned about early American history, but the Reconstruction was a pivotal period. It was actually our best opportunity to reshape the trajectory of our country, and we destroyed the opportunity. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed. The 13th abolished slavery, the 14th provided citizenship and due process and equal protection to Blacks, and the 15th Amendment provided the right to vote. But the 13th Amendment was ultimately ratified in December of 1865. Do you know when Delaware ratified the 13th Amendment? It was 1901. We needed to think about it a little bit. And Kentucky ratified the 13th Amendment in 1976. And finally, Mississippi decided that they guessed that they would get on board too. So Mississippi ratified the 13th Amendment in 1995, but they didn't register that ratification until 2012. So there you go. The tide began to turn after the passage of those amendments, however, and in 1872, Congress passed the Amnesty Act, and it returned full civil rights to the Confederate leaders. During Reconstruction, the former Confederate leaders weren't allowed to vote, weren't allowed to hold office. Many of them expected to be imprisoned, if not executed, for treason. But instead, in 1872, all of their rights were restored, and they were eligible for public office. And the Supreme Court began its assault on the architecture of Reconstruction. So in 1876, Black voters were brutally targeted on election day, and it resulted in a tie between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden. So Congress and the Supreme Court made a deal that Hayes could become president if he promised to end Reconstruction. So in 1877, the federal Reconstruction oversight was removed, and all the progress that had been made in electing Blacks to federal, local, and state office was overturned. Next. I don't know how familiar you are with the term Black codes, maybe very familiar. I was not. But there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment, which says that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. Next. So Black codes were laws that were only applied to Blacks, and they provided for arrest and for a series of crimes. It could be if you were stopped on the street and you could not prove that you were employed, you were arrested and incarcerated. If you didn't step off the curb when passing a white person going the other way, you could be arrested and incarcerated. And so then you became eligible for the state to determine where you would work and who would receive the proceeds from your labor. And so the concept of convict leasing was implemented because these laws led to the mass arrest and incarceration of Black people. In this way, the criminal justice system became the central institution for sustaining racial domination and hierarchy. The states could sell the labor of state and local prisoners to private interests for state profit. So these convicts were leased out to US Steel, to mining companies, to railroads, to plantations, and the state reaped the proceeds from their labor. In 1883, 10% of Alabama's state revenue came from leasing convicts, and by the time the practice was ended in 1898, 73% of Alabama's state revenue came from leasing convicts. And that year, 25% of the convicts died. Because if you think about it, if you had a slave on the plantation, it was in your best interest to keep that person healthy and working. But if you were leasing a convict and the person died, you just called up the state and asked for another one. And so the treatment of these prisoners was horrific. And on top of everything else, it intensified the stereotype of the dangerous criminal Black male. Next. Jim Crow laws were next. I think we're probably more familiar with those. They were not laws that specifically referred to Blacks, but they were laws that focused on segregation and voter suppression. And so there were different rules for Blacks and whites. And in 1896, there was yet another Supreme Court case called Plessy v. Ferguson that had to do with Homer Plessy wanting to ride in a white rail car. And the Supreme Court determined the principle of separate but equal and made segregation the law of the land. As a result of that, Mississippi initiated something called the Mississippi Plan that was also adopted by 7 other states that imposed voter registration rules, understanding clauses, poll taxes, literacy tests to prevent Blacks from being able to vote. In Louisiana in 1896, there were 130,000 registered Black voters. By 1904, there were 1,342. And by 1910, all of the southern states excluded Blacks from voting and therefore from jury service. They also adopted something called the white primary. They petitioned the Supreme Court, who determined that political parties are private organizations and not subject to federal law. And so the parties could determine that only white people could vote in the primaries. And so as a consequence, it was the candidates selected by the white voters who were always the ones running for office. All of this existed until 1964 with when the Civil Rights Act was enacted. And so how was this enforced? I mean, why did people go along with this? Next. And the technique, sorry, the technique that was used, one more, Bob, sorry. The technique that was used was terrorism. Rourke mentioned lynching and the lynching museum. My own personal awareness of lynching was the idea of throwing a rope over a tree and hanging someone who had done something terrible, and that was determined to be an appropriate punishment. But in fact, it is so much more than that. Racial terror lynching is the set of actions that Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative reference. Next screen, Bob. There were more than 5,000 of these terror spectacle lynchings in 12 southern and 8 non-southern states between 1877 and 1950. And the purpose was to terrorize the Black citizenry. These lynchings featured prolonged torture, mutilation, dismemberment, burning, and then the bodies were deposited in the Black communities as a warning for what would happen if you stepped out of line. So when Rourke talked about his family moving to Wilmington, the fear and the danger was very real. These public spectacle lynchings drew huge crowds. Often thousands of people, elected officials were present, the mayor, the governor, the police chief, and 99% of the perpetrators escaped punishment. There have been 200 plus attempts at a federal law to outlaw lynching, and as you know, the most recent attempt failed yet again. But I'll give you one example of one of the terror spectacle lynchings. Next one, Bob. John Hartfield was a resident of Ellisville, Mississippi, had a population of 1,000 people. And you'll see the headline in the paper, John Hartfield will be lynched by Ellisville mob at 5 o'clock this afternoon. So this was no act of passion, no storming the jail. It was carefully planned and orchestrated. And in fact, into this town of 1,000 people came more than 10,000 people. They brought picnic lunches, they brought their children. The governor said he was powerless to do anything to stop it. So John Hartfield was hung, tortured, body parts were cut off for souvenirs, 2,000 bullets were fired at him. One of them severed the rope that he was hanging from, and after his body fell, it was burned. So this was the nature of the lynchings that took place. And the last documented lynching occurred in the United States in 1952. So this is not just something that happened 100 years ago. Okay, Bob, one more. You may also have heard about Greenwood. It has been more in the news lately. That is the Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as the Black Wall Street. That was the site of the worst race massacre in US history. Westminster pastor Greg Jones grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he first learned about Greenwood when he was in his 50s, because all reference to it was scrubbed from communication. As we speak, the mayor has authorized digging up a spot or 2 spots in Tulsa that they believe may be the site of mass graves that were used as a result of the Tulsa massacre. That part of the city, which had been flourishing Black community, was turned into an industrial area, in part to increase the space between the white Tulsa and the other Black residents in the city. And so the 11,000 people who lived there never returned, and it never recovered. Okay, next. So then we get to the modern legacy of slavery, and each of these topics merits considerable investigation and information. The Great Migration, as Rourke said, as it turns out, more than 6 million Black citizens from the rural South moved to northern cities between 1916 and 1970 to escape the living conditions, the repressive laws, and the terror, and also because of the economic opportunity. But in response to that influx, cities limited where Blacks could live, and a series of Supreme Court decisions resulted in the prevalence of private parties using real estate covenants were attached to deeds that said you would not sell your property to anyone but a white person. So by 1940, 80% of Chicago properties, LA properties, and 85% of Detroit properties carried these restrictive covenants so that those houses were not available for Blacks to buy. But even more significant was the creation of the FHA. In 1934, it was instrumental in alleviating the home ownership crisis, but it institutionalized racism and segregation because of the residential security maps that were created for 239 cities that color-coded areas of the city that were considered good risk for mortgages. And the red-colored sections of the cities occupied by Black residents were considered risky investment properties, and so virtually no mortgages, very few mortgages, were granted to Blacks who lived in those parts of the cities. And further, as suburbanization increased, no one would sell a property and mortgage a property to a Black potential buyer. And in fact, the FHA underwriting manual itself prohibited giving a mortgage to inharmonious racial groups. So all of that was apparently eliminated with the Fair Housing Act of 1968, but it continues today. In 2015, HCSB was fined $33 million for doing precisely that in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And what's most significant about it is that housing policy leads to housing segregation, leads to educational segregation, and the economic impact that results, not least of which is the inability to access home equity, which is one of the greatest sources of personal wealth in the country. School desegregation is another significant issue. The separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson had a devastating effect on education. And as Rourke said, by 1950, there was only one high school in the state of Delaware that a Black student could attend, regardless of what county you lived in. And as a consequence, the average Black education was 7.2 years. And we're talking about 70 years ago. Resistance to Brown v. Board of Education was massive. The District Court for Delaware authorized a 12-year delay in its implementation. Prince Edward County in Virginia closed every single public school for 6 years. Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, and South Carolina declared the federal courts had no jurisdiction. Georgia repealed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and voted to impeach the Supreme Court. And the Southern Manifesto was invented, whose purpose was to stall and defy the orders. And so today in Delaware, our schools are more segregated than they were at the time of the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And because schools are heavily funded by property taxes across the country, the housing segregation impacts the quality of education, and certainly Delaware's public education system is in desperate need of reform. I think we're all probably aware of many of the major events of the civil rights movement, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. The war on drugs has had a significant impact on the African-American population in the country. In June of '71, Nixon declared the war on drugs, and his associate John Ehrlichman said that Nixon most feared the anti-war left and Blacks. And so the focus of the war on drugs to associate and arrest hippies as a result of marijuana violations and Blacks because of heroin violations. Then of course Reagan came along in 1980 with the war on drugs. And in 1986, mandatory minimum sentences were introduced. As far as racial discrimination, the crack versus cocaine distinction has been huge. Crack cocaine is cheaper than powder cocaine. Crack cocaine tended to be used by poorer people, and by association, more Black people used crack cocaine than powder, even though pharmacologically they're the same. And even though Blacks and whites use drugs at about the same rates, the arrest and incarceration rates skewed heavily toward Blacks. And finally, in 2010, the Fair Sentencing Act reduced the sentence disparity, which used to be a sentence 100 times worse for crack cocaine to powder cocaine, to only 18 times worse. And yet, obviously, still significant in terms of incarceration rates. And what's interesting as we look at the opioid epidemic, a lot of people involved in that epidemic is treated with calls for compassion and treatment versus the approach that was taken for cocaine and crack cocaine. And of course now, marijuana use is legalized in a number of states, so we still have people in jail for the use of marijuana, which is not even a crime anymore. But it's important to recognize that the US criminal justice system is racialized at every step in terms of number of arrests, in terms of number of people charged, in terms of the plea bargains that are offered, in terms of incarceration rates, and in terms of conditions of release. So for the issue of mass incarceration, our country has less than 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's inmates. In the 1990s, the Get Tough on Crime meant that a new prison was being built every 2 weeks. And the states couldn't keep up with it, and so the concept of private for-profit prisons was introduced. In 1998, there were 5. In 2008, there were 100. I don't know how many there are now, but their profits were up over 500% in 20 years. And you have to ask yourself, if you're running a for-profit prison, how much of the revenue do you derive are you going to spend on rehabilitation programs, especially since recidivism is a great source for increased profits in the future. A brief mention of cash bail. This is a significant issue in Delaware. In Delaware, 25% of Delawareans in jail and 40% of females are incarcerated awaiting trial. So they haven't even been tried and convicted, but they are in jail because they cannot pay the cash necessary in order for them to get out. And I guess the last thing, and a real highlight, because it is 2020 and we have a huge election coming up in the fall, but voter suppression is enormous in terms of the damage being done to the Black members of society. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 made huge strides in overcoming voter suppression. And it was required that it be reauthorized every 5 years. Well, in 2006, Congress overwhelmingly reauthorized it for 25 years. The vote was 390 to 33 in the House and unanimous in the Senate. But in June of 2013, the Supreme Court invalidated a key part of the law, where locales that were historically known to suppress the vote were relieved of the necessity to get pre-clearance for changes in their voting laws. Within 8 hours of the Supreme Court decision, Texas instituted a voter ID law that had previously been blocked by the pre-clearance requirement. Redistricting laws no longer need federal approval. Early voting conditions at large elections, polling locations, same-day registration, all those rules could be changed with impunity. And so in North Carolina, they took the number of early voting locations in the state from 16 to 1. Alabama closed the DMV offices in 8 of the 10 counties where the Black population is greater than 75%. Now, 13 states provide automatic voter registration these days. 15 other states have proposals in the works. If automatic voter registration were incorporated, Election Day made a national holiday, and independent commissions to draw election district lines were established, it would make a huge difference in whether or not the United States is a democracy. So there is work to be done in supporting legal changes as well as minds and hearts. So where do we go from here? It's essential to understand our history because it shapes our present realities. We can see how many of the negative stereotypes of Black people are a direct result of intentional public policies that were designed to disadvantage them. It's been said convincingly that you cannot have grown up in the United States during the 20th century and not be prejudiced. We have been bombarded with messages of a people's inferiority, laziness, criminality, threat. If you haven't seen the powerful documentary, The Eye of the Storm, you should. It's about racism in Iowa in the 1960s and Jane Elliott and the power of prejudice. Speaking to white people in our country, this is not about individual guilt. We did not institute slavery, participate in lynchings, hire convict labor, create laws that segregate. But if we have been unconsciously or perhaps willfully ignorant of the bigoted actions that permeate our history, and we have often been silent. And we benefit from the system as it exists. So this is about acknowledging the biases we hold, bringing them into the light of day, examining them, and then choosing how we react to comments, to events, to circumstances, and what actions we will take to help right these historic wrongs. We need, in partnership with our brothers and sisters of color, to assume a vital advocacy role. If as Christians, we really believe that everyone is a child of God, if as Americans, we believe that all are created equal, then we have an obligation and an opportunity to educate ourselves about inequality, to share that knowledge with family and friends, to initiate dialogue, and to stand up for justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. My goodness, we're getting personal experiences, we're getting historical information, and finding ways for it all to sort of come together. There's a question asking if Sue's presentation can be separated from all of this, and I don't know the answer to that for other use for other people, but you can get in touch with Sue. We can arrange for that because I know she's got 3 hours worth of material. So,
and there are a couple churches where I've been asked to give the class, and I'm more than willing to take the show on the road in abbreviated or full format, whatever.
Thank you. Thank you. People will be glad to know that. I want us to be aware of time. We have about 20 minutes that we need to shave off of other things in order to honor our commitment to you. And so what we're going to do now is have our panelists, and I'll introduce them to you, and we have a few questions for you, but panelists, I will be asking you to be clean and concise in your answers so that we can make sure we get information from everyone. And Bob, I wanted to ask you, do we have an update yet as far as our hope for having breakout groups?
It looks like we will not have breakout groups. Still working on it though, just checking again.
Okay. I apologize for that. I know like it's set up so we can do breakout groups and we can't find where it falls through that we can't actually do it. So, but okay, our panelists, and when I am talking about you, would you wave your hand a lot so everybody can know who you are? Charles Knox. He is an elder at the Presbyterian Church of Dover. He was the police chief in the city of Newark, New Jersey. So he is bringing to us some very unusual life experience there. Julius Jackson is there, waving his hand wildly. He's an elder from Community and for Community Presbyterian Church and a former moderator of this presbytery. Paula Massey, waving her hand. She also, Paula, are you an elder from Community? Yes. All right. Can I allow participants to see who is being introduced? Well, I asked them to wave their hand. So let me do that again. Charles Knox, wave your hand. There we go. Julius Jackson, wave your hand. And Paula Massey, wave your hand. Thank
And
you.
Tracy, if
Yes.
people want to click on gallery view in their webinar format rather than speaker view, if they click on gallery view, they should see other people, I hope.
Gallery view?
Gallery view.
Now?
But probably when people make their presentations, you want to go back to speaker view so you just see one person.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Rourke Moore, whom you have already heard from, is one of our panelists. John Hanson. John is a teacher at a Friends school, isn't that right, John? And he is also married to one of our ministerial candidates, Shannon Hanson, and he was with us on the Montgomery trip. And Ann Ledbetter is a pastor in this presbytery. She's both a chaplain and a pastor at Church on Main, and she also was with us on the Montgomery trip. And you will see them when they speak. So if you don't have gallery view, don't worry. When we'll invite each person to speak, and we have several questions. The first question is this: how often do you think about race? Charles Knox, would you like to go first?
All the time. I think about race all the time because I'm constantly reminded that I'm an African American. I have to be on guard all the time. And it doesn't matter who I'm interacting with if they're a person of another race, because I have to anticipate some racist or prejudiced remark. And that was especially prevalent when I became a police officer in the Newark Police Department. In our department, we had a terrible reputation for all of the things that people like Rourke talked about, and these things that you see on television with George Floyd, and with every other situation that you can think about. We were considered brutal, racist, and corrupt when I became a police officer in 1965. Myself and a few other African Americans thought that we were really aggravated with the conditions that existed, and therefore took it upon ourselves to try to get educated and to pass police exams so that we would become the leaders in that department and try to transform it. And over a period of 9 years, from 65 to 1974, we engaged in the political arena, elected an African-American mayor, and he appointed us to transform the department. And it took us 11 years to be recognized from a national level as one of the best police departments in the country. We transitioned from all that brutality, that corruption, and became one of the departments selected by the federal government to implement the concept of community policing.
Okay.
And we were very successful in that implementation. Okay, and recently in the city of Newark, there were people who were demonstrating against the conditions that exist today, and there was not one single police officer that did anything wrong to the demonstrators.
Okay.
Now, this is 2020.
That says a lot. That says,
Okay.
yeah.
Myself personally, I'm a product of the ghetto in Newark, New Jersey, born there. In a dysfunctional family, a welfare recipient for most of my life. And that was because my father was injured on a job and he couldn't work. And at some point, he left the family. And I didn't really have a good relationship with cops. As a matter of fact, I didn't even hold them in very high regard. But I became a police officer to change that perception about them. So the prejudice was more during my experience as a cop, because I lived in a segregated neighborhood. So everybody there had to try to survive to get out of it without going to jail.
Okay.
I am from a family of 7 children. And I always wondered when I was younger how I was able to survive and go on to have a good life. My family wasn't very religious. No, as a matter of fact, there wasn't any religion, except that existed with my grandmothers, both my grandmothers. They're both churchgoers and very, very solid Christians. But in my household, religion didn't exist. So in reflecting upon my life, it had to be nothing but the Lord intervening. Because I was the one that got out of it unscathed. And I've had a wonderful life. I mean, and I give all glory to God. And that's my story.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a beautiful story. And you still don't have a day go by that you don't think about race, right?
Not a day.
Yeah.
Not a day. I live in a very, very comfortable community here. And people are nice. But when I see some of their remarks on Facebook about the current conditions, it isn't anything that I don't expect.
Mm.
And that's a shame.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's ask the question. John Hanson, can I ask you quickly, how much do you think about race? How often?
Well, that's a kind of a fascinating concept from Charles. And I'm just kind of letting that soak in and think about that. And as a white middle-aged male, I think about race when I'm teaching history and when I'm involved with the students. I think that candidly, there are probably 1 or 2 weeks that sometimes will go by where I don't think about race. It's not something that is present directly in front of me. Over the past 3 years, I have developed a very close friendship with a colleague who is African American at school, and we spend a fair amount of time together socially. And he has shared that concept that Charles just shared, that he is constantly thinking about race. And at times when I'm with him, I look to see how others interact with me as compared to how they interact with him. Or if he will come around a corner and say, hi, John, how that interaction will change with a server or some other member of the public. So those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Ms. Paula Massey, how often do you think about race?
Hi, everyone. Every day. I mean, it's nonstop, obviously, as the previous panelists, Mr. Charles and Rourke. I mean, we are a product of our environment, just like I just said, Mr. Charles, because we're so used to saying certain things because we've been conditioned to think in that space. And so it is always with us. If you're Black, you just are Black and brown, but you definitely are thinking about it nonstop. Where we go, we're in stores, we're with our children, when we're at events, when we're in our workplaces. I am constantly, even now that we're working from home and I'm on the phone, I still got to think about race. I got to think about how I'm sounding across the line. Does someone think that my voice tone is too strong and I'm coming across maybe giving them an impression that I'm telling them what to do, or I cannot speak in a way that gives them opportunity to see that I'm providing feedback, that valuable feedback. I have been experiencing those type of things in my life daily. I mean, ever since I've been in the workforce or have been in different situations and growing up in school. I thought about what Work shared earlier, how we might see someone that we thought we were best buds with, but when we see them on the street, they don't know us. I had that experience just within the last year, that someone that I worked with, when I saw them in the store, they didn't know me. And I was just floored that here it is in 21st century, we're still dealing with this. Like, and my husband was with me. So I'm thinking, even to that point, we're together, and all of a sudden this person turned their head more than once to ensure that I did not recognize them. And we worked on the same floor at my job. Okay, so we deal with race daily. It's painful, but as was stated earlier, we have to have these uncomfortable conversations. When Sue was going through her presentation, it was very painful. But it's been the information that we have not been shared, that has not been shared. And so our children, school children, they don't know the history. They don't know the awful past. They don't know all the issues that African Americans, Blacks, Brown have faced over the years, that we are still facing, that the George Floyd situation should have never happened, and all those before him and those who have come after him. It should never happen. But we are still dealing with it. And the only way we can start to make a difference, or not start, but continue to make a difference, is to have these painful conversations, to be uncomfortable in the space that we're in, to continue to talk, to have this opportunity to have this panel. My church buddies will tell you, I am not the type to be on Zoom. I hide behind the camera all the time. So when Tracy asked me to do this, I still don't know who gave her my name, but I stepped up to have this conversation. And I feel really compelled because we have to tell our story. We have to be able to get out here in front of everyone, that, individuals where we know, and share our story. One of the things I've learned lately is that if you have the power, again, Rourke spoke to this, the other panelists have spoke to this. When you walk in as a white person, when you walk into the room, you have certain unmerited power, period. You can walk in, certain things are afforded to you right away that we don't have as African Americans. When you see the injustice, we need you to speak up. That's part of the problem, because folks aren't speaking up. So we are always dealing with it. You turn the blind eye, you don't say anything. We go, it's okay. I had that happen to me in a business meeting not so long ago when we were still in the office. I was cut off and my white manager did not speak up, white male did not speak up. And so I had to go it alone. I was the only African-American in that room and I had to brunt that. That was painful. But he should have spoke up, but fear causes us not to. So as we continue to have these conversations, the energy, the courage, the confidence to speak up is going to be the difference maker. So I just wanted to obviously share that. You can see I'm getting really passionate because over these last few weeks, it has really been an awakening of so many of us who are mad that we were not taught our history, that we were, because Black History Month never really covered, again, the information that Sue shared in her presentation. We never learned Black history in that way. I think if we learned about the Reconstruction, we learned about the Jim Crow more, we had better information, I don't think we would be in this today. As I learned from one other individual that mentioned, we cannot give up. We must have hope, because when you give up hope, racism is guaranteed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. When you had referred to Mr. Charles Knox, there was a question that came up in the feed, so let me veer off for a moment here. The woman who posted the question said she's constantly called Miss Marge. No matter how many times she says, just call me Marge, is that a sign of respect or a sign of subordination? Should I be calling others Miss or Mr. And so forth? So what, do you have anything you'd want to say to?
I think previously the Miss and the Mr. was of a subordinate element. I think it depends on the person. I see Charles Knox as a senior saint. So for me, I would add that level of respect to that, not out of subordination, but because of a level.
I think you froze for a moment, Paula. I think she froze just for a moment here.
When we say the Miss and the is because, oh, did I froze? You, now Tracy, you're frozen.
Now. I think you're back on.
Oh, all right. Well, at the end of the day, I think it's a mixed bag. It's something that unfortunately I think we've learned over the years that was conditioned as part of a white versus Black conversation. And I would just say that I think when someone is more of a senior saint, as I was with Charles Knox, I would most likely refer to him as Mr. Knox or Mr. Charles, but it's just one of those things that we've learned over the years. So.
It is. I heard someone once say that just when she was coming into the place of having earned her degrees and so forth, that all of her white colleagues had suddenly gotten on this, let's all be really comfortable and not use titles anymore. And it was a, so I think a sign of respect in some ways to be able to use titles when possible. We have another question coming up here. That Sue's presentation had some depressing items in it, especially recognizing that things are not going terribly well right now. Question is, what do we Christ followers do about all of this? And that person is offering also thanks for this conversation that we're having here. Julius Jackson, former moderator of this Presbytery, I'm going to throw two of these at you. One, in case you really, really, really wanted to answer it, how often do you think about race? But the other one might be, what do you say to us Christ followers, especially white Christ followers, not white Christ, but white followers of Jesus, who are asking, what can we be doing? Which is a huge order, but can I put both to you?
The quick and simple answer is to live up to your commitment to your faith and everything you do. Just as in the sense that I always have to think about race in everything I do, we should be thinking about our faith and our commitment to our faith and everything that we do. So I guess being the proverbial good Christian at 24/7. And unfortunately, we all fall short of that. And that's the problem. So if we were more Christ-like constantly, it's a quick, simplistic answer. But the question is, when we do have these conversations, we have to follow up and decide. We said, well, what are we doing? What are we doing in our congregations? What are we sharing with the members of our congregations? And as a group, what are we doing with other folks in the community to correct these things? Is it our responsibility to call all faith leaders together and say, hey, look, let's sign a pledge of equality and to fight justice and demand it from the people who run our institutions? I think the comment I had, just like I have to think about race constantly, I should want people to think about equality and justice in every decision and everything they say and do. And granted, we slip sometimes, but if we had that mindset that whatever I do is going to have an impact, not only on myself, but those around me in my community, I have a responsibility to seek justice and equality. And I think, I think about that. I can't stop thinking about race. And the closest I may have gotten is when I'm quarantined, because I'm just home, but I still have to pick up the paper. I'm still getting news feeds coming through this little thing constantly. And I can't watch the news, and it's always there. But the frightening thing is, I'm almost I'm glad my grandkids don't watch TV. They said, well, Papa, we don't watch regular TV. We just pull stuff up. We don't watch the news or read the paper. We get information from you and the parent, but we don't talk about it. But the scary part is that I still have a fear that this system is going to hurt them because they're still innocent, and but they're starting to learn the differences and the nuance of racism in the system. So all of a sudden I have a conversation with my oldest granddaughter that says, well, I said, well, I hear you want to go take music. And she said, yeah, but don't want to go with that teacher because he's a racist. And now I have to have that conversation with her, or I'm worrying now that she's being potentially subjected to something. And so I said, well, look, if you ever feel uncomfortable, you tell your father, and you don't feel comfortable, you call me, you tell me, and we'll take care of it. But it's constantly racist, always on the minds of people of color. I walk into a room, I think it's mentioned before, I'm always in a situation of feeling I'm in a space that I'm not supposed to be in. I'm being looked at differently. I'm being spoken to differently. I'm getting facial expressions different than the other folks in the room. And I've had this happen in public, stores, restaurants, professionally on the job, and even in churches, unfortunately at times. I've gone in and said, well, I get that look. Why? What is he doing here? And what's he want? And you get tired of that, and I try not to be the angry black guy. And at times I should be, for all the things that go down and have happened. And one of the depressing, I think one of the new, it has been depressing to relive this stuff. And for some of us who, I went to Howard in DC, so we had Black history. And I was there during the so-called revolutionary period, where we went back through all this history. We went through discrimination. We also looked about the economics of discrimination. And basically, as Sue brought out, in that time, this country was built on the blacks, free black labor, and provided 80% of the finances that came into this country. That's unheard of, that one group of people provided, that basically built this country physically and economically. So, okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Anne, do you have, how often do you think about race?
I think about it most days, certainly not in the same way that Paula and Charles and Julius do. But I work in a place where all the residents are white, and 30 to 40% of our staff is Black. And so it's on my mind. And so that's a struggle for me, and it's a struggle for me. Our part of our church, or one of our activities right now, is reading and discussing how to be an anti-racist by Kendi, and we're looking at ways that we can specifically make a difference. And I'm thinking how the senior staff here at Heron Point is 10 white people and only 2 males. But why can't we have 1 or 2 people of color on our senior staff? And we should have, you know, Black residents too. And the residents want to be more diverse. So that's a struggle for me, and a sadness for me, where I feel positive is that I live in a neighborhood that is more diverse than any neighborhood I've ever lived in. It's a 55+ community, and in my block, 25% of my block are African Americans. One of my next door neighbors, and these are people I see every day, which is another reason that maybe I think of race. But I love that, and I'm in a church that's more diverse than any I've ever been in. And we have a Black Lives Matter flag, and we have a rainbow flag, and we're looking to not just hang that flag, but to act it out, to live it out.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have 12 minutes, and a lot of that's going to be taken up with our wrap up and our closing litany, which Rourke puts you in a terrible situation. I'm sorry about that. But I wanted to circle back to you to see if there's something that's been coming up for you that you would really like to say, something that you feel like we need to hear that has not yet been said.
Did you direct that question to me?
I did.
Yeah. I think that one of the things, the questions was asked about what can we do as church?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that one of the things that we can do about church is to be, as church, and particularly as people who are clergy and members of the Word and Sacrament, and who have the opportunity to teach, is to begin to share with our congregations and others the rich diversity that makes up the canon. My understanding that the canon, the Holy Bible that we use and describe the faith story of the people in the Bible, originated in an area that is populated by people of color. Okay, so we don't often share that with congregants. I'm gonna try to cut it short. I like movies and books, and there's a book and a movie called A Time to Kill, and the setting takes place in around a court case, and the lawyer who is defending the accused asks the jury to consider the events that have taken place that has gotten this man to be on trial. And he maps out and he gives a very good description of what happened to this man's daughter. And he asks the jury to close their eyes as he goes through this description. And then at the end of his statement, he says, "Now imagine if she were white." And the defendant gets acquitted because the jury can now see this person through their own lens. And I think that sometimes as church, we need to do this, to give our congregants an opportunity to look through a different lens. I shared this with you earlier, Tracy, that every Advent we tell the story of Jesus Christ being born. His earthly father has a dream that he should take his family to Egypt and hide. Well, we have to consider when this takes place. In 5th century Egypt, we know that is in Africa. Okay? Quite often, we hear that story and then think of a baby Jesus with blue eyes and blonde hair. My guess would be that it would be very difficult to hide a baby, a family, with blue eyes and blonde hair in 5th century Egypt. So if we began even to tell the story differently, to have different icons in our churches about who we think Jesus Christ may have looked like, okay? And the songs that we hold up and sing as faiths, as our part of our faith story. If we would just begin as church to do those things, to begin to untell the story, to unravel the story about how this story became justification to maintain white supremacy, to undo that, to get the story right, then I think that we can help move the conversation along if we as church would do that.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Lord. There are wonderful questions coming up in the thread, and we don't have time to go into all of them. The breakout rooms, obviously, as you can see, were not able to happen. Here were the questions we were going to ask about that. What do you wish more people understood about the issue of racism? What's uncomfortable for you about these conversations? And where do you see your own growing edge? What might you do to encourage that growth? One of the things that I, think about is that this house that we live in, we didn't build it. We weren't responsible for the renovations that happened over the years with all of the things that changed. And some of them were well renovated and some of them were wonky and not well done at all. But we live in this house, and we're responsible for it. So looking for ways that we can move on from here. There are more conversations to be had. There are books and discussions. We have those on our website. You can look up things that, that you can read, films that you can watch. But I would also encourage intentional relationships. If you have things that you would like to talk to any of the members on the panel, get in touch with us at the Presbytery and we can put you in touch. I know that they are generous souls who would be willing to talk with you. Have church partnerships, get in touch with the Montgomery group that is also working through this Presbytery. And as has been mentioned before, be a voice for change. And that has to do with voting, that has to do with letting your voice be heard, but it also happens within our churches. There are ways that we can talk about this and shift and change the perspective of folks so that it is not only Black voices speaking up for what is needed, but it's also for white allies and advocates to join voices with Black voices to speak up for what is needed. We have a litany for closing, do we not, Nita?
Yes, we do.
And I believe
what I'd like to do as we go through is after your response, I'll give us a minute of just kind of reflect on what we've just said. So often we just read things and it sounds good, but we don't really take it in. So we'll go slowly. It's a little tricky to do responses the way we're set up, but try it and see how we go. So let us join together. We are who we are in this moment.
Loved by God, humbled by grace, called into courage.
And we have the vision of who we are called to be.
Loved by God, humbled by grace, called into courage.
We are not strangers to sin, but even in sin, we are
loved
by God,
humbled by grace, called into courage.
As followers of Jesus, confession is a necessary part of the rhythm of our lives, that we are
loved
by God, humbled by grace, called into courage.
We have often shrunk back from speaking the truth, been too energetic in justifying our comfort, and preferred to blame others for our lack of compassion. And yet we are
loved by God, humbled by grace, called into courage.
May we be moved by the stories of our siblings. May we chastened by awareness of our own biases. May we be inspired by the Holy Spirit to fresh courage as we seek to understand and work to make our homeland a place of liberty and equal justice for all. Let us go from this place knowing that we are
loved by God, humbled by grace, called into courage.
In the name of Jesus Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit, we pray.
Amen.
Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thank you, everyone. A special thanks to Bob Schminke and Sarah Holben and Donna Scully for all the work behind the scenes, and to Tim Yost, who is also our sort of Zoom manager behind the scenes, for our panelists, for Sue, for our commissioners. And thank you, everyone who carved out time to be here today. We're really grateful for your presence. So go in peace, everyone.
And
Amen.
if you'd like to leave a comment in the chat room, feel free to do that. It'll be open for a few more minutes. Bye.
Take care.
Take care. Thank you, everybody. I love the comment there about that constant vigilance around race taking a toll on physical health.
You're muted, Julius.